The room echoed with screams as my late husband's second wife falsely accused my 12-year-old son of theft and, without warning, punched him hard on the nose. The force was so brutal that he staggered back, collapsing onto the floor, blood dripping down his face. He looked at me, sobbing in pain, his small body shaking. Before I could reach him, what happened next was even worse. "Hello, my name is Vivian Reed, and I am 38 years old. I have lived in Westwood, a quiet suburban town, for the past 3 years. My life changed drastically after the loss of my husband. Since then, I have focused on raising my 12-year-old son, Oliver, and keeping my life as stable as possible. But no matter how hard I tried, the shadows of the past never completely disappeared. The early summer sun filtered through the curtains of my colonial-style house, illuminating the freshly bloomed rhododendrons in my front yard. Though the house was 85 years old, I took pride in maintaining it in pristine condition. It was a legacy of my late husband, a place filled with both beautiful memories and lingering grief. This Sunday afternoon, I was busy preparing lunch in my spacious kitchen. The aroma of perfectly seasoned steak filled the air as I set the table. My island-style kitchen, equipped with high-end cookware, reflected my love for cooking, something my husband used to appreciate. Meanwhile, Oliver, who had just finished his school assignments, was lounging in the living room, flipping through a book. His posture, his expressions, everything about him reminded me of his father. A wave of nostalgia tightened my chest, but I quickly shook off the emotions and focused on the meal. Just then, the doorbell rang. I wiped my hands and took a deep breath before heading to the door. Adelaide and Cameron stood there, their polished appearances reflecting their high social status. "Sorry we're late," Adelaide said with a polite smile, pulling her fiancé, Nathan, into the house. Adelaide was dressed in an elegant designer dress, looking more refined than usual. Her poised posture, the way she carried herself, it all reflected the sophisticated upbringing she had in Westwood's elite circles. Nathan, a renowned architect, offered a warm yet modest nod as I welcomed them inside. Beside him, Adelaide beamed with pride. She had met Nathan during the planning of a luxury housing project, and their relationship quickly blossomed into an engagement. As we settled into the dining area, the conversation naturally drifted toward the upcoming wedding, scheduled to take place in 2 weeks. "The venue is set, the ballroom at the Grand Royal Hotel," Adelaide announced, excitement evident in her voice. "The guest list has reached over 200 people." I noticed the subtle way Cameron stiffened at the mention of expenses. A grand wedding like this clearly exceeded the family's financial means. "Adelaide, what about your new home?" Cameron suddenly interjected, smoothly shifting the topic. "We're looking at properties in Fairhaven," Adelaide replied confidently. I held back a sigh. Everyone in town knew Fairhaven's real estate prices were sky-high, far beyond what Adelaide and Nathan could afford based on their current salaries. I sipped my tea quietly, not wanting to get involved in the conversation, especially since I had already sensed Cameron's growing dissatisfaction regarding the family's finances. Though nothing was said outright, the unspoken tension in the air was undeniable. As lunch came to an end, Cameron approached me privately. "Vivian, I need to discuss something important," she said, lowering her voice. I turned to her, instantly picking up on the tension in her tone. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Oliver hesitating near the staircase, his eyes filled with concern. He must have sensed the shift in my mood. "Actually, it's about Adelaide's wedding expenses." Cameron's voice wavered slightly. A chill ran down my spine. I had a bad feeling about this conversation. With only 2 weeks left until the wedding, could this tension hold until then? I walked toward the window, took a deep breath, and braced myself for what was coming next. I turned away from the window and faced Cameron, my fingers tightening around my teacup. "What about the wedding expenses?" I asked, though deep down, I already had a sinking feeling about what was coming next. Cameron let out a small sigh and smoothed the wrinkles on her designer dress before speaking. "Vivian, we've been like family for years, haven't we?" she started, her tone carefully measured. That was her way of softening the blow before making an unreasonable demand. I remained silent, waiting for her to get to the point. You know how much this wedding means to Adelaide, she continued. She deserves the best, something truly memorable. But with all these rising costs, venue, catering, the designer dress, it's becoming difficult to manage. I was hoping— She hesitated, then met my gaze with a look that almost seemed practiced. That you could help cover some of the expenses. There it was. The words hung in the air like an unwelcome guest. I placed my cup down carefully, making sure my expression remained neutral. Cameron, I understand Adelaide wants a beautiful wedding, I said steadily. But I don't see why that would involve me. Cameron's lips pressed into a thin line, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face before she quickly masked it. Vivian, let's be honest. You have financial security. After your husband passed, you and Oliver inherited everything. Adelaide, on the other hand, got nothing. I stiffened at the words, my grip on the edge of the table tightening. So that's what this was really about. Cameron had never outright voiced her resentment before, but I always felt the bitterness simmering beneath the surface. Cameron, my husband's estate was distributed according to his wishes, I said evenly. I didn't decide who got what. She exhaled sharply, tapping her manicured nails against the table. I'm just saying it would be fair if you helped, considering everything. Fair, I repeated, my voice colder than before. Oliver is still a child. His future depends on those funds. You're asking me to take from my son so that Adelaide can have a luxury wedding. A flash of irritation crossed her face, but before she could respond, we were interrupted by Nathan, who walked in, completely unaware of the tension. Vivian, that was a fantastic meal, he said warmly. Thank you for having us. Of course, I replied, forcing a polite smile. Cameron dropped the subject, but I could see it in her eyes. This wasn't over. 2 weeks passed in a blur, and soon, the morning of the wedding arrived. The bridal suite at the Grand Royal Hotel was filled with a soft hum of excitement. Sunlight streamed in through the wide glass windows, casting delicate patterns on the silk curtains. The pristine white wedding gown stood before a full-length mirror, the lace details shimmering under the light. Adelaide sat at the vanity as the makeup artist carefully adjusted her blush, her hands trembling slightly with nervous anticipation. Lift your chin just a little, the makeup artist instructed gently. Mother, why don't you sit down? Adelaide asked, glancing toward Cameron, who was pacing near the window, visibly agitated. I'm fine, Cameron muttered, though her fingers trembled as she sipped from a porcelain teacup. Something had been off about her behavior all morning. Across the room, Oliver sat in the corner, dressed in a navy tuxedo, looking every bit the young gentleman. As the ring-bearer, he had been entrusted with carrying the wedding bands. But there was something about the way he occasionally glanced at his grandmother that made me uneasy. The rings are safe, right? Cameron suddenly blurted out, her voice strangely urgent. I raised an eyebrow at the question. I'll check them, I offered, moving toward the small case where the rings were kept. No, Cameron interrupted quickly. It's the mother's duty. I'll do it. A peculiar feeling of unease settled in my chest as I watched her step toward the dresser. Just as she reached for the box, chaos erupted. The rings are missing. Cameron's panicked voice cut through the room like a blade. The entire bridal suite fell into stunned silence. What do you mean? Adelaide's face drained of color. They were here just a moment ago, Cameron insisted, her voice rising in panic. The wedding planner immediately called hotel security, and the room was turned upside down in a desperate search. Cushions were tossed, bags emptied, drawers flung open, but the rings were nowhere to be found. Then, Cameron turned toward Oliver, her expression darkening. Oliver, she said slowly, you were near the dresser earlier. Do you know anything about this? Oliver's eyes widened in shock, and he quickly shook his head. I didn't do anything, he protested. Cameron took a slow step toward him, her gaze sharp, almost predatory. I saw you looking around the dresser. Her voice carried a dangerous conviction. That's not true. Oliver stammered, his voice trembling with fear. Then Cameron's eyes caught something. His tuxedo pocket was slightly bulging. For a moment, The entire room went silent. Then, in an instant, Cameron's fist shot forward, striking Oliver hard on the nose. "Why did you steal the wedding rings?" she hissed, her voice filled with accusation. Oliver stumbled back, clutching his face, his eyes wide with pain and terror. Blood trickled from his nose, staining his crisp tuxedo shirt. "I didn't take them," he cried, his voice cracking. But Cameron didn't listen. She shoved her hand into his pocket and pulled out a small blue velvet jewelry box. The entire room stood frozen as she held it up in victorious accusation. "Look," she exclaimed. "See what your son has done, Vivian?" Adelaide gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Oliver sobbed, his shoulders shaking violently. The sickening realization hit me all at once. Cameron had just falsely accused my son of theft in front of everyone, and worse, she had physically hurt him. My body went cold with fury. I stepped between my son and Cameron, my voice deadly calm. "What have you done?" The room was so silent, I could hear Oliver's ragged breathing. But this wasn't over yet, because something felt very wrong about this situation. I took the box from Cameron's hands and slowly opened it. Inside, the platinum rings gleamed under the sunlight. But there was something about them that didn't feel right. I held the blue velvet box in my trembling hands, my breath shallow. The platinum rings inside glistened under the soft light, but something about them felt off. Across the room, Oliver sobbed quietly, blood dripping from his nose onto his tuxedo, while Cameron stood triumphantly, convinced she had proven his guilt. "Look at what your son has done, Vivian," she spat. "He stole Adelaide's wedding rings. You've spoiled him too much, and now he's turning into a thief." I gently touched Oliver's cheek, my heart breaking at his terrified expression. His face was pale, and his eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Mom, I swear I didn't take them," he whispered. "I know, sweetheart," I assured him softly. Then I straightened and turned my gaze on Cameron, a cold, burning rage settling inside me. "You just punched a child in the face," I said, my voice eerily calm. Cameron flinched, but she quickly masked her reaction, folding her arms across her chest. "And a child who stole something deserves to be punished," she said matter-of-factly. "You seem so sure of that," I replied, tightening my grip on the jewelry box. "But before we condemn Oliver, let's take a closer look at these rings." I turned to Nathan, the only one in the room with enough sense to remain quiet through the madness. "Nathan, you're an architect. You work with high-end materials. Do these rings look real to you?" Nathan hesitated, then stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. He took the rings from my hands and examined them under the light. "They're not as heavy as I would expect," he muttered. A chilling silence fell over the room. Adelaide, who had been frozen in shock, suddenly stood. "Wait," she said sharply. "What do you mean, not as heavy?" "I mean, these don't feel like genuine platinum rings," Nathan clarified. "I've worked with luxury materials for years, and something about these seems off." I saw Cameron stiffen, her hands gripping the sides of her expensive dress. I took a slow breath and met her gaze. "Cameron, how did these rings end up in Oliver's pocket?" She didn't answer immediately, instead glancing toward the door, as if debating whether to run. "I don't know," she finally said, her voice too controlled. I nodded, then turned to the hotel security guard, who had been standing by, awkwardly. "I assume this hotel has security cameras?" I asked. "Yes, ma'am," he replied. "Then let's check the footage," I said. For the first time, true panic flashed in Cameron's eyes. "That's not necessary," she blurted out. "Oh, but it is," I replied smoothly. "Because I believe we're about to find out exactly how the rings got into Oliver's pocket." 30 minutes later, a large screen was rolled into the room, and the security guard began playing the surveillance footage from earlier that morning. The entire room stood in complete silence, waiting for the truth to unfold. On the screen, the footage showed the bridal suite at 9:30 a.m. Cameron entered the room, walking straight toward the dresser. Then something unexpected happened. She reached into her purse, pulled out a small blue velvet box, and carefully slipped it into Oliver's tuxedo pocket while his back was turned. A collective gasp filled the room. Adelaide's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide in disbelief. "Mother," she whispered. I turned to Cameron, who was now visibly shaking. "You framed my son," I said, my voice deadly calm. I didn't mean to," she started, but Adelaide cut her off sharply. "Why would you do this?" Cameron's face drained of color, her body trembling. I had no choice," she finally whispered. "I needed the down payment for your new house." A stunned silence fell over the room. "What does that have to do with the rings?" I demanded. Cameron let out a shaky breath. "Those aren't the real rings," she admitted. Nathan's eyes widened. "What?" I pawned the real ones," she confessed. "For money. I thought I could replace them after the wedding, but then I panicked." "You pawned them," Adelaide whispered, looking like she might collapse. Cameron nodded miserably. "I thought if I made a scene, if I blamed Oliver, everyone would focus on the theft instead of questioning the rings themselves. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks." "So you framed my son to cover up your own crime?" She had no response, just a guilty silence. Nathan rubbed his temples, clearly disgusted. "And let me guess," he said. "The real rings are gone." "They're at a pawn shop downtown," Cameron admitted. A heavy silence filled the room. "Unbelievable," Adelaide muttered. I turned to Oliver, whose face was still red and bruised from the punch she had given him. "You accused my son, you punched him, and you tried to ruin his name. All to hide your own selfish mistake." Cameron finally broke down, collapsing into a chair. "I was scared," she admitted. "I thought if you found out, you'd all hate me. I just wanted Adelaide to have the perfect wedding. I didn't want her to struggle financially. So, your solution was to steal and frame a child?" I snapped. She covered her face with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. "I'm sorry," she whispered. But the damage had already been done. "Security," I said, turning to the guard. "I believe you have a report to file." Cameron's head snapped up. "No." "Please don't call the police," she begged. I looked at her coldly. "You're going to return those rings," I said. "And then we'll decide what happens next." Adelaide exhaled shakily, then turned away from her mother in disappointment. The truth was out, and Cameron was about to face the consequences. A suffocating silence filled the bridal suite. Cameron sat slumped in her chair, her face pale, her perfectly styled hair slightly disheveled from stress. The weight of what she had done settled over the room like a dark cloud. Oliver, still holding his nose where she had punched him, sniffled quietly. His tuxedo shirt was stained with blood, his wide eyes filled with shock and betrayal. I knelt beside him, gently dabbing at his nose with a tissue, my own hands trembling with fury. Adelaide, who had been frozen in stunned silence, finally turned to face her mother. "You did all of this over money," her voice cracked. Cameron wiped her eyes quickly, trying to regain some dignity. "I did it for you," she said desperately. "You and Nathan need a house, and I didn't want you to struggle. The rings, it was the only way." "The only way?" Nathan repeated, his voice like steel. "So your solution was to steal, frame a child, and physically hurt him? That's what you call helping?" Cameron flinched at his words, but she held her ground. "I panicked," she said, her voice rising. "When I realized I wouldn't be able to get the real rings back in time, I thought if there was a distraction, if someone else took the blame, maybe what?" I cut in, my voice sharp as a blade. "Maybe my son would be branded a thief. Maybe you'd humiliate a child to save yourself? You hit him, Cameron. You punched him." A flicker of guilt crossed her face, but she quickly shook her head, as if trying to justify it to herself. "I didn't mean to hurt him," she muttered. "But you did," I snapped. Nathan, who had stood silently processing everything, finally turned to the hotel security guard. "You called the police, right?" Cameron's head shot up in panic. "No, Nathan, please. Don't do this." But Nathan held up a hand, his expression hard. "You assaulted a child, stole expensive rings, and tried to frame someone else for it. If that's not a crime, I don't know what is." The door swung open, and 2 uniformed police officers stepped in. "Mrs. Cameron Walters," one of the officers addressed her. She visibly swallowed, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair. "Yes," she answered, her voice barely a whisper. The officer flipped open a notepad. "We were informed of an incident involving theft, false accusations, and physical assault on a minor. Would you like to explain your side of the story?" Cameron shook her head quickly. "It was a misunderstanding," she said, her voice bordering on hysteria. "I didn't mean to. I just—" "Ma'am, the security footage shows you planting the rings in the child's pocket and later striking him in the face." Adelaide let out a shaky breath, covering her mouth. She turned to Nathan, her eyes filled with a mix of grief and humiliation. "I can't believe this," she whispered. Nathan, his jaw clenched tightly, merely nodded. "Neither can I." I stood beside Oliver, gently rubbing his back, whispering reassurances in his ear. His small hands clung to my dress, his entire body still shaking from the ordeal. One of the officers sighed and turned to me. "Mrs. Reed, as Oliver's mother, would you like to press charges for the assault?" All eyes in the room turned to me. I looked down at Oliver. My son, my world. His face was still bruised, his once bright eyes dimmed by fear and betrayal. I started, but I hesitated. Cameron, despite everything, was Adelaide's mother. She was a woman who had clearly lost herself in desperation and greed, but she was still someone's family. Adelaide's tear-filled eyes met mine, silently pleading for mercy. But then I looked at Oliver. The pain in his expression made my decision clear. "Yes," I said firmly. "I want to press charges." Cameron let out a strangled gasp, her body sagging as if the weight of reality finally hit her. "No, please, Vivian, don't do this," she begged. But the officer stepped forward. "Mrs. Walters, please stand up," he instructed. Cameron shook her head wildly, her breath coming in panicked gasps. "Please, I didn't mean to." "Ma'am, if you resist, we will have to use force," the officer warned. Tears streamed down her face, but she slowly stood up, her hands shaking. "Mom," Adelaide whispered, her voice filled with disbelief and heartbreak. Cameron turned to her daughter, her face crumbling with regret. "Adelaide, I'm so sorry," she choked out. "So am I," Adelaide whispered. The sound of metallic handcuffs clicking filled the room. "Cameron Walters, you are under arrest for assaulting a minor and attempted fraud," the officer announced. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As they led her away, Cameron's sobs echoed through the hallway. I turned to Oliver, who was watching the scene unfold with wide, exhausted eyes. I knelt in front of him, brushing the hair back from his forehead. "It's over now," I whispered. He nodded slowly, but I could see that the weight of what had happened still lingered on his small shoulders. Adelaide, meanwhile, stood frozen, tears streaking her makeup. "I didn't know," she whispered. Nathan placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, but the damage was done. This wasn't just about a wedding anymore. This was about a family that had shattered under the weight of greed and deceit. The wedding never took place that day. Instead, Adelaide spent the evening in a hotel room, mourning the mother she thought she knew. Over the next few weeks, Cameron's legal case moved forward. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison for assault and theft-related charges. The real wedding rings were retrieved from the pawn shop, and Nathan's parents offered to buy new ones as a gift. 1 month later, a smaller, more intimate wedding was held. This time, there were no grand ballrooms, no excessive displays of wealth, just family and real love. Cameron was not there. Instead, Adelaide walked down the aisle, carrying the weight of the past, but choosing to step into a future built on truth, not illusion. As for Oliver, he healed, little by little. He continued his tennis matches, his confidence slowly returning. And I made sure he knew, every single day, that he was never alone. Because in the end, wealth and appearances meant nothing. But family, the real kind, was everything. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel for more amazing stories. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support means the world to us. See you in the next story.